Let's set up the materials. I want to try a couple of color schemes, and we're going to start with something like gray walls and light brown wood. So I'm going to go to my textures and I'm going to change the wood to a different color. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer. And the color I'm looking for is somewhat like maybe something like this. Okay. Let's reduce the opacity. Merge down. And adjust the curves. Okay. And using the hue saturation, let's make it a bit lighter and less saturated. I think something like this. Now let's also make a reflection map. So just desaturate it and make it slightly contrastier. This, let's save it. And we can use the same map for the bump. Right, let's go to our wood material and I'm going to change the diffuse texture to this one. I'm also going to reduce the blurring to 0.2 or something like that. Let's set up the reflection map. Right. I'm going to reduce the blur as well. And the number of Fresnel reflections. Set them at something like 4. Looks good. And let's blur it a bit. Alright, like that. And we can also copy the reflect map and paste in the bump slot. And set it to 1, 2. Let's set it to 1. Alright. Next up, let's fix the glass material. So for glass, the diffuse should be very dark, with strong reflections. Of course, enable the Fresnel. And check the Effect Shadows option and Effect Color and Alpha channels, like this. Okay, so that's base in glass. For the brass material, I'm going to change my diffuse color to slightly darker, well, much darker. And I'm going to set up a lighter color for the reflections. Actually, let's change the reflection glossiness. Let's reduce it so it's nice and blurry. I'm going to change this material to gray blend material. Keep it as submaterial and copy it to the second slot as well. And here I'm going to increase the glossiness to 0.98. So this way you get some nice specular highlights and pretty crisp reflections. Right. Now you just need to increase the subdivs for the first material. Let's try 16 for now. Alright, so next is the chopping block, we'll leave that for later. And then there's the granite. Let's find a nice marble texture. Let's try Emperador. I'm gonna look for large images. So let's change it to larger than 4 megapixels. And let's copy this image, create a new image in Photoshop, paste it, and crop like this. Again, select all, copy, and cut the canvas to a square size. Right, and paste. I'm going to rotate this pasted part like this. Okay, so now I'll merge them down. I'm using the clone stamp tool. First pick the source and then get rid of the seams. Okay, and now we want to make it tileable by getting rid of the seams along the edges. So try the offset filter. First select all, copy, paste, so make sure there's nothing outside the canvas, and then use the offset filter. Adjust it like this to get the seams in the center of the image. And clone them out. And so this looks pretty good, I think. Let's adjust the color a bit, make it a bit less saturated and slightly darker. Maybe shift the hue towards the greens a bit more. And make some adjustments with curves as well. So let's try it like it is right now. Save the image. It's now in marble. And go back to our scene. Okay, let's assign this to the diffuse slot. Turn on the preview. And looks like we need to fix the mapping. Okay, let's start with this island. The size looks okay, maybe a bit smaller. and assign the same mapping to this object here. Perfect. I think it might be a bit too light. Let's make it darker. Let's try some photo filters to make it a bit warmer. And desaturate a bit. Right. Now it's too dark. Let's lighten it slightly. Okay, let's leave it. So next up is the ceiling. For ceiling, let's change the value to 30, so it's not as white, and enable some reflections. Give them Fresnel, set it to something like 3. And blur them to something like 0.4. That's good. Now the walls. For walls, I want a light gray texture. But we want some interesting reflections and bump. Let's try CG textures. And look at some grunge textures. Okay, I'm gonna look at grunge maps. Like this one, let's take it. I'm gonna grab the largest size and open it in Photoshop. First, let's desaturate it. Then select all, copy, and then make it square by cropping. And let's paste. Rotate a bit. And delete with a soft brush to get rid of the border. Okay, merge down. And let's make it tileable. All right. Let's add something on top of it. For example, this one. Again, I'm going to grab the large size. Select all, copy, and paste over this image. And let's scale it up. Duplicate, move down, and delete like this to get rid of the sharp border. Right, just some cloning to make it less styling. So copy all, delete the layer, and paste to get rid of everything outside the canvas. And try the offset filter. Alright, let's get rid of these borders. And now desaturate it and try some blending modes to get some interesting effects. Like this one actually. Alright, let's merge down, increase the levels a bit to make it more contrasty, and save the image. Let's resave it at full quality. Okay, so back to max and set up a reflection map. Let's see how it looks. Looks pretty bad. Need to add some mapping to our object. Alright, one more thing. Let's isolate the walls. And window and door aisles usually don't have this paint on. They're left white. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add edit poly modifier, select all these aisles, and set the material ID to a different one. For example, 2. Make sure the rest is 1, and that's good. And let's change this material to multi-sub. I'm gonna use the ceiling material in the second slot. Let's make an instance. Alright, so now the walls are gray and these aisles are white. It's pretty reflective right now. Let's enable Fresnel and set it to 4 and blur the glossiness. And I want to try, okay, first let's reduce the blur for this texture, and I want to try to copy this texture in the reflection glossiness slot as well. Okay, looks nice. Maybe let's reduce the amount slightly, like 50 or 65. Okay, good. And let's copy it to the bump slot. Let's get a bit more blur here in the bump. Maybe let's rotate it so it's not the same. And reduce the bump amount to 2, 3. Okay, let's try 5. And I'm going to increase the subdose a bit to make it a bit smoother. Right, so that's the wall material. Let's add the UV mapping to this extruded element as well. That's good. All right. And for these backsplashes, I want to use another type of marble. Let's look at the CG textures first and see if we find something interesting. Okay, let's look at some beige marbles. maybe even dark gray. Let's look for large images. This is interesting. It's a bit too blurry. Let's look for something else. Let's try Wayne marble. Okay, so this is pretty nice. Let's take both of these and combine them. Copy this image, make a new one in Photoshop, paste it. Copy this image, back to Photoshop. Let's increase the canvas size a bit. Paste the image, maybe rotate it. And let's try to adjust the colors of the first layer. To match better. It's good. And add more contrast to the second layer. Right. Let's merge them together. Fix the seams. And let's duplicate the layer. Like this, and maybe rotate it. Merge down and close the seams. Right. Let's crop it to square. Copy everything, paste, and use the offset filter. Right, and get rid of these seams on the center now. Let's save it. Marble 2. And I forgot to finish setting up this countertop. Let's get some reflections. Set the glossiness to 0.97 maybe. Enable Fresnel and set it to 3.5. Looks alright, maybe let's add a slight bump map. can increase the size to 150 and set the bump amount to 1.5. Alright, now back to our splash guard material. Let's create a new one. So create V-Ray material, and it's splash guard, and set up the diffuse map. And let's drag and drop it on the splash guard. See how it looks. Looks pretty bad. Let's add UV mapping. Maybe let's make it smaller. And move it around until you get a nice interesting pattern going on. You can rotate it if you wish. Right, like that. Let's leave it. Okay, so it's saving for a while now. And let's give some reflections to this material. It should be pretty similar to this one here. Maybe let's make it slightly blurrier. And copy and paste the bump map from the other marble. Right. I'm gonna go ahead and add this material to the sink as well. Maybe let's make the sink white porcelain. So let's create very fast SSS2 material, use marble white preset. Okay, let's desaturate all these colors. Since porcelain is pretty white. And in the specular layer you want to enable reflections and bring up the glossiness to a pretty high value like 0.98 or something. Okay, looks good. That's gonna be the porcelain. Okay, next up is the trim. For trim we're going to use the same wood material. So this material is not needed. Again, so next is the floor. Maybe let's set up some tiles. Let's go back to CG textures and see if we have some tiles there. Maybe let's use this texture and modify it slightly. I'm going to download the tileable version, open it in Photoshop. First, let's change the colors to less saturated, slightly greener. And now we need to create a bump map. Let's duplicate the layer and try some selections. Alright, let's increase the tolerance a bit. It's too much. Using the magic wand, I'm selecting the main parts of the tiles. So select everything that isn't a seam. Okay, don't worry too much about these tiny specks that are left. It's alright. Just get most of them. Okay, zoom out. And press Ctrl J to duplicate the selection. Right, for the lower layer, reduce the lightness like this. Okay, let's delete this little piece here. Okay. Let's do the saturation. And this is gonna be our bump map. Tiles bump. And this is going to be the diffuse map. Tiles diffuse. Right, so here's the floor material. Let's set up the diffuse map first. And we need to increase the tiling. Right, let's fix the mapping first. Let's leave the tiling as it was, one by one, and fix the floor mapping instead. Let's use a planar map and make sure both dimensions are the same. I also want to rotate it 45 degrees to make it a bit more interesting. Okay. Now let's add some bump. Okay, first I'm going to reduce the blur. Actually, and set up the bump map. Alright, let's leave it at 30 for now. And let's copy the bump map. To the reflection slot. And set it at 50. Okay, let's blend it with a gray color. Of course, enable Fresnel, set it to say 4. And blur the reflections to like 0.85 or so. Okay, 0.8. Let's increase the subdose a bit. Make the reflections a bit weaker. Okay, so the bump is a bit too rough. Let's increase the blur back to 1. 0.9. And mix the bump map with the noise map. Let's set it to 100. I accidentally changed it instead of mixing it, so change it to mix. And get back your bump map in the second slot. And now mix it at 50. Okay, good. Maybe let's increase it to 60 or 50. Alright. So looks okay in the preview. Next is the oven material. And let's change the paint color first. Let's try something, maybe something like this. With some light reflections. Blur them to 0.95, enable Fresnel. Let's set it at 3.5. And let's leave it like that. Okay, so the chrome material looks pretty good. Brushed metal is okay, I think. Maybe let's change the chrome parts to brass. It's gonna be a bit more interesting this way. And let's change the light slightly. Alright, and make it a bit refractive. Let's give it a green fog color. Okay. It's just a basic shiny transparent green plastic material. The lights are so small it will not be visible. And for the red one, just change the hue to red. Okay. So that's that. Next. Oh, okay, let's pick the lantern material. Bring in the brass and the glass materials. And change the candle material slightly by changing the diffuse color to slightly beige, adding some light reflections. And let's blur them to 0.85, enable Fresnel, and set it to 3. This looks alright, maybe slightly stronger reflections. It's good. Okay, now for this part, I'm going to try some different tiles. I'm going to make a material from the same one we have here. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the lightness value, reduce the saturation, maybe play with the curves a bit. And save it. Okay, let's copy the material, rename it to tiles, and change the diffuse map. And this one. Okay, and let's assign it. And now I just need to fix the mapping on this part. Let's make them much smaller. Alright. Maybe let's try rotating the texture by 45 degrees. It's fine. And let's rotate the reflect map as well. And the bump map too. Okay. Looks like something's wrong with the bump map. I see. We have it in the noise. Let's get rid of that. And double check this second floor material and see if we have it in noise, and yes. And let's get rid of that. Alright, so that's the tile material. Now let's look at the chairs now. Alright, let's leave this wood material as they have right now, and maybe let's mix it with a darker color like black. Let's mix it at 50. Or maybe even more, like 30. Okay, let's copy the reflection map from the first wood material and paste in the bump slot as well. And let's blur the reflections. 0.95 maybe. Enable Fresnel and set it to 4. Looks alright. Maybe the bump is much too strong. Okay. Now let's look at these blinds here and change the material to V-Ray two-sided. Right, set the front material as a simple V-Ray material, and we're gonna change the diffuse to a fabric. Let's try this one. Download the large image, open in Photoshop. Okay, for some reason the internet is getting pretty slow. Alright, let's wait. Okay, select all, copy, and crop to square. Okay, paste. And delete the top edge to make a smooth transition. Okay, merge down. Maybe let's desaturate it a bit like this. And now let's try the offset filter. And just fix the seams. Okay, looks good. Maybe slightly more contrast needed. And again, need to desaturate. Alright, looks nice. Not sure about the dark spots though. Okay, let's see how it looks first. Let's save it as blinds. Go back to max, select one of the blinds, isolate it, and see how the textures looks up close. Right now it doesn't look like anything. Let's add the map. Let's try a box map. Okay, the size looks alright. Let's reduce the blur, otherwise it will not be seen at all. And maybe let's create a bump map straight away by increasing the contrast and reducing the saturation. Okay, so that's a bump map. Save it. Go up here and assign it in the bump slot. Right. Again, let's reduce the blur, 0.1, 0.2. And drag and drop the mapping on these other blinds as well. Okay. Back to the chair. Forgot to finish the fabric and the black part. For the black part, I'm gonna make it reflective. Blur it to 0.9. Nimble Fresnel, set it at 3. And that's good. And for the fabric, let's try something like, okay, let's take one of these textures here. Let's take this one. Download the large size. Copy everything, crop the square. And delete the border. Right. Let's try offsetting. It's very hard to see any seams here. Okay, let's desaturate it. Bring up the contrast with levels. Slightly lighter and more contrasty. And let's overlay a color. Okay. Let's try this for now. Right. I think there's too much contrast. Let's get rid of it. Okay. Let's save it. So let's save this fabric and create a bump map. And save this fabric bump. Back to max. Let's isolate one of the chairs. I'll zoom closer and set up a diffuse map first. Looks good. Maybe the scaling is a bit too large. Let's set the tiling to 2. And looks perfect. Right, let's reduce the blur. And copy the map to the bump slot. And here in the bump slot, change it to correct texture. Okay, let's set the bump weaker, maybe 10. And change the diffuse color to a fall of map. Let's keep the old map as submap. Copy it to the second fall of slot and mix with white at 50. Now using the curves, I'm gonna adjust it so the white appears only at the edges. Like this. Just a very, very weak effect. Okay. And I think the color should be darker. Let's use the curves to make it darker. And save it. Right. That's okay for now. I think we covered all the basic materials we need, except for the chopping block. All right, let's do that now. Chopping block usually has an end grain pattern on top, if it's a good quality block. Let's look for some of those. It's hard to get a nice photo here. Let's set them to large. Alright, here's a nice image. Except that it's too blurry. Okay, let's look at this one. This is nice. Let's copy the image, paste in Photoshop, and crop it like this. Okay, and I want to transform it with the distort tool. Okay, enable the grid so you can see if the lines are straight or not. And fix them. Right. Looks good. I want to get rid of these white parts here, so I'm gonna select a color, create a new layer and paint over them with a brush. And try some different blending modes to see if I can get rid of them. And like that. It's fine. And let's save it. Okay, and let's create a reflection map. And save it as well. Okay. I'm also going to take my mahogany material, make it a bit warmer. Okay. And create some strips so it looks a bit uneven. Like that, merge down. And make some parts slightly darker. Okay, looks like some boards glued together. It's good. Chop sides, desaturate, bring up the contrast a bit. Back to max, select your block, isolate it, and let's set up the material IDs first. So let's set the top to have the material ID 1. Okay, and autosave going on. Right, so set the top to 1. And the rest to 2. Let's create a new multi-sub with just 2 materials, and for the first one we're gonna set up a V-Ray material with the end grain pattern. Okay, looks good. And for the second ID, we're gonna set up the other texture. Okay, and we need to fix the mapping. Set it to box and make sure it's vertical. Right. I think it's close enough, nobody will notice the difference. Actually, the side grain should be lighter than the end grain. So let's open the chop sides and bring the curves up like this. Okay, that's good. Maybe to desaturate it a bit more. Yeah, let's leave it. And finally set up the reflection map. Reduce it to, let's say, 0.75. Enable Fresnel set to 3. That's fine. And do the same for the end grain. Right. Looks good. And I think those are the basic materials. We will tweak them after we add some lights. I'm just gonna scale these lanterns slightly smaller. Okay, and adjust these pedals here. So let's copy them upwards and make another layer. Like that. I think this looks better. Okay. Maybe let's change that to 3 lanterns. 3 smaller ones instead of 1 large. I mean, instead of 2 large. This is still a bit too large. Alright, like that. Alright. And next up is the lighting.